In this video, I want to talk about metaphysical indeterminacy. This is the idea that the world itself is said to be fuzzy, indefinite, or vague. Before I kind of jump into some examples of metaphysical indeterminacy, I want to kind of clarify it a little bit from some other kinds of indeterminacy that you might run into. So first, saying that the world itself is indeterminate is not to say that our knowledge of the world is indeterminate. That is, we lack information about objects, properties, relations, or the facts of the world. In saying that there is metaphysical indeterminacy, we are not talking about what we know or don't know. Instead, we're making a claim about the world itself. Second, saying that the world itself is indeterminate, that is, there's metaphysical indeterminacy, is also not to say that our characterization or our way of representing the world is indeterminate. That might be the case, but there's another point being made here. Things aren't fuzzy because our words fail to adequately express the precise nature or the precise facts that are found in the real world. Rather, when someone says that there is metaphysical indeterminacy, they are saying that while our words may be fuzzy, there's also fuzziness found in the world. So even if we walked around with totally precise ideas in our head, our theories are crystal clear, there still would be these fuzzy facts found in the world that just kind of resist this precise formulation. So in short, when someone says there is metaphysical indeterminacy, they are saying that indeterminacy is not merely epistemic, that is having to do with our knowledge, and not merely semantic, having to do with how we represent the world. What people are saying when they are talking about metaphysical indeterminacy is the world itself. Some facts, objects, properties, relations that are found in the world are indeterminate, fuzzy, or vague. Now, this is a super controversial idea, since many people will say that there is simply no such thing as metaphysical indeterminacy. It's not found in the world. And they'll try to say that all the source of indeterminacy that we might think is in the world is really due to epistemic considerations having to do with our knowledge, or semantic considerations having to do with how we represent the world with words. Or they will say even stronger that even the idea of metaphysical indeterminacy is incoherent. It doesn't make any sense, and you can actually prove this. I actually think it's somewhat difficult to give a precise definition of what it means for something to be metaphysically indeterminate, precisely because there's so many different candidates or kinds of metaphysical indeterminacy. And so to give a definition that groups all of them together in one clean definition is, I think, a difficult task. So rather than give you the definition, I wanted to point to some examples of things that might be metaphysically indeterminate. In addition, I also promised some people that I would do a video where I make a pumpkin loaf. So I'm going to start by actually making the pumpkin loaf. And while the pumpkin loaf cooks, we'll return to a discussion of metaphysical indeterminacy. If you don't want to see the cooking portion of this video, I'll put timestamps below so you can skip this part altogether. Okay, so let's make this pumpkin loaf. The first thing we're going to need to do is see what ingredients we need. So we need a 15-ounce can of pumpkin puree. We're going to need some baking powder. We'll also need some baking soda, pumpkin pie extract. This is a little bit hard to find sometimes, but if you don't have pumpkin pie extract, you could try to use cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg instead. I'm actually going to use them both. I'm going to use the pumpkin pie extract as well as all three of these ingredients. We'll need 3 eggs. I think you can get away with 2 eggs in here, but I'm going to use 3. You'll need either canola oil, about a half cup or 3/4 of a cup, or 1.5 sticks of softened butter. I usually use about 3/4 of a cup of canola oil. I usually don't use butter, but I don't have any canola oil on me, so I'm going to use butter this time. You'll need some granulated sugar, flour, some pepitas or pumpkin seeds, usually ones with no salt that we'll sprinkle on top, and some salt. Okay, now that we have all of our ingredients, it's helpful to see what tools we need in order to make this pumpkin loaf. It's really frustrating to watch someone make something and you don't really know what things you need. I would say you need a bread tin, 2 bowls, a small bowl and a large bowl, some kind of device to measure teaspoon, tablespoons, as well as a thing to measure a cup or a half cup. A mixer is super helpful. You can try to stir it yourself, but if you have a mixer, it's going to go way faster. You also need an oven since we have to bake the pumpkin bread. A spatula is helpful as well. Okay, so let's start by taking most of our dry ingredients and putting them in a small bowl. So we'll take all of our spices, a half teaspoon of cloves, half teaspoon of cinnamon, half teaspoon of nutmeg, toss it in a small bowl. In addition, we will take 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, 3/4 of teaspoons of baking soda, and half a teaspoon of salt, and toss it in the small bowl. Once it's in the small bowl, then we will mix it together or whisk it together. You could use a fork if you don't have a whisk. Next thing we'll do is in our large bowl, we'll scoop the sugar. I'd say either 1.5 cups or 1.25 cups. Or if you really like it sugary, I've seen some recipes that say 2 cups. And then we'll add our 1.5 sticks of butter into the large bowl. Then we'll mix it all together until we don't see any more sugar left. It's all mixed in with the butter. I'd say if you leave the butter out a couple hours before you start the process, you shouldn't be able to push all the way through it, but you should be able to at least push towards the center. Then the butter is ready to go. If you try to microwave it, it always tastes funky. The next thing you'll do is add each one of the eggs one at a time and then mix them as you go. I think in the past I've thrown all 3 eggs in at once. I can't tell the difference, but I'm sure that since this is such a recommended practice, I'm sure there is a difference if you add them one at a time. But your palate probably just has to be more sophisticated than mine to appreciate that difference. The next thing we'll do is add the pumpkin pie spice extract to our mixture here in this large bowl. I'm going to add a full tablespoon, and I'll also add the pumpkin pie puree. It's about a 15-ounce can, and then we'll mix it all together again. I've never made actually pumpkin pie puree from scratch, like with a pumpkin or pumpkins. So if you have, and you have a good recipe for this or some advice as to whether or not to do it or not to do it, I'd love to hear your response. I've talked to a couple of people who said they have made the pumpkin pie puree, and it's just too hard or too time consuming. It's just much easier just to buy a can of it. Next, we'll add our dry ingredients from the small bowl into the large bowl, and we'll mix everything together. Now we will add 2 cups of flour, and we'll add the flour a little bit by bit and fold the flour in. We won't use the mixture here. Apparently this causes a bunch of air to get into the mixture. Again, I'm not a professional baker, so we just kind of want to mix that in gently. Next thing we want to do is actually grease the pie tin or butter the pie tin in some way. I forgot to do that here. And so here's when all the catastrophes start. In addition, this mixture is looking really strange. Maybe because I haven't ever used butter before. I've always used canola oil in the past. So it's a lot thicker and goopier than I remember. At this point, I smooth the loaf out a little bit. And then the next thing I'll do is add some pumpkin seeds to the top. You could be a little bit more careful about it than I'm doing right here. You could place them in some kind of design if you wanted, but I'm kind of in a rush, so I'm just tossing them on here. At some point halfway through, you want to preheat your oven to 350 degrees. And once it's at 350, you can put the loaf tin into the oven and you'll cook for about 60 minutes. You can use a toothpick and poke the loaf, maybe towards the end, to see if the interior or middle part of the loaf is done. Okay, back to metaphysics. Let's look at some examples of metaphysical indeterminacy. So the first one I want to start with are the parts of ordinary objects. A classic example involves objects like mountains, clouds, even your body, just any ordinary object that you can find. So let's start with the example that's usually used with is Mount Kilimanjaro. This is a famous mountain, dead volcano located in Tanzania. Certainly there are objects that are not part of Kilimanjaro. If we take, let's say, my hand here, my hand is not part of Mount Kilimanjaro. Other objects are clearly part of the mountain. We might say a rock that's found in the middle of the mountain is part of the mountain. So it's clear that there are some objects that are definitely part of Mount Kilimanjaro, and there's definitely some objects that are not part of Mount Kilimanjaro. However, some might contend that it's sort of metaphysically indeterminate whether some objects are part of the mountain and some parts are not. So here are some examples or candidates of things that it's not quite clear one way or the other whether or not they're parts of Mount Kilimanjaro. So what about some loose dirt near the base of the mountain that gets kicked up in the air? Is this part of the mountain or not? What about the grass or trees on the mountain itself? Are the grass and trees part of the mountain, or are they just on the surface of the mountain? Is the snow, let's say, on the top of the mountain or on any part of the mountain? We might say yes or no about the snow, but then you can kind of think about your own body. Well, let's say you put makeup on. Is that makeup part of you, or is it just on the surface of you? It seems like the answer would be it's not part of you, but a lot of times when we look at mountains, we tend to associate them with the snow being on top of that mountain as being part of the mountain. Let me give you another example. Let's say I took a pumpkin loaf that I am making and I buried it in the mountain. Is that pumpkin loaf really part of the mountain? Well, it's connected to the spatiotemporal boundaries of the mountain and it's inside of it. It kind of seems like it's not. You can do this for a number of different objects. Let's take the pumpkin loaf that I'm currently making. Remember, we put pepitas or pumpkin seeds on top of the loaf. Are the pepitas part of the loaf? You might say sure, they are stuck to the loaf, but let's say you take it out of the oven and some of the pepitas fall off of the pumpkin loaf. Then you might not be really clear. It's not really clear if they're definitely part of the loaf or definitely not part of the loaf. Here would be a candidate for something being metaphysically indeterminate. It's just not quite clear whether or not something, the pepita, is part of the loaf or not. Somewhat related to this idea concerning the indeterminacy of parts to an object are the spatial boundaries of objects themselves. It might be unclear when exactly the mountain begins and ends. At what point when you start walking towards the mountain do you cross the threshold of, okay, now the mountain has started? This has more to do with the spatial boundaries and it simply being vague as to where it ends and begins. Other examples might include clouds. You might not be quite clear when the cloud sort of begins and ends. You can kind of see where it definitely isn't and definitely is, but it's not quite clear where the sharp cutoff is between where it ends and begins. Another set of examples have to do with when objects go in and out of existence. When do they die and when are they born? Let's take the pumpkin loaf that we're making. When does it become a pumpkin loaf? When I mix the ingredients together? Well, maybe. I might say, let's put the loaf in the oven, but maybe here I'm just speaking loosely because I might say, this isn't a loaf, it's just a tin of batter. Okay, well, what about the batter that has been baking? Is this a pumpkin loaf? You might say, sure, but it's not quite clear as to when it transforms from batter to loaf. At 1 second, at 2 seconds, at a minute, at 30 minutes, when it's out of the oven, when it's been taken out of the tin. It's not quite clear when the precise instant or second is when it transforms from batter to loaf. Those that believe in metaphysical indeterminacy will say that this is not simply due to our ignorance about loaves or our use of words about loaves. Even if we knew everything that there is to know, and even if we had precise ideas in our head, it still would be kind of indefinite. There would be an indefinite fact about the world when the batter becomes a loaf. And so the reason we can perhaps not give a precise answer is because the world itself, loaves themselves, are indeterminate or fuzzy. The same thing can be said about things going out of existence. When is the loaf no longer a pumpkin loaf? Our pumpkin loaf is surely a pumpkin loaf when it's been baked and is cooled and is sitting as a whole in a particular location. And it's still in one piece. But when does it start to die or perish or no longer exist as a loaf? Now let's say I took the loaf and I cut it into slices. You might say that the loaf no longer exists. I've sliced it up and so we have pumpkin bread or pumpkin loaf, but it's no longer a loaf. Instead, it's a bunch of slices of loaf. But I could take those slices and, so say, jam them back together and say, look, I have this kind of loaf here that's connected. I could tie some string around it so it's a complete unity again. So you might say, well, okay, the slices themselves, it's still a pumpkin loaf. They're just separated in space. But let's think about this idea from a different angle. Suppose I start nibbling at the end of the loaf with a small kind of animal. I'm taking little bites of it here and there. Surely one small nibble doesn't turn a loaf into a non-loaf. I've only taken a little bite or a piece. I haven't destroyed the whole thing. So surely one small nibble doesn't kill the loaf or cause it to cease to exist. But if that is the case, then another nibble shouldn't change the loaf into a non-loaf. And then if that's the case, then since single nibbles don't transform something from a loaf to a not-loaf, it's too small of a difference to make a difference. But this is kind of problematic here, because if we keep nibbling on the loaf, then there will be no more loaf left. And surely it makes no sense to say that there is still a loaf when we've eaten the entire thing. So you might say at some point in the process of us nibbling on this loaf, it went out of existence. But at what point? So proponents of metaphysical indeterminacy might say that even if we knew everything there was to know about loaves, we still wouldn't be able to point to a precise moment, a precise nibble, when that loaf goes out of existence. This is because there is no precise moment. When the loaf goes out of existence is metaphysically indeterminate. There's a fuzzy fact about the world as to when things begin and end. Let's look at one more example. This one has to do with the metaphysics of time. Will our pumpkin loaf, the one that we're baking in the oven, will it be delicious? Some people think that the future does not already exist and is open in nature. So what does the world have to say about whether our pumpkin loaf is delicious in the future? That is, will it be delicious at some future time? Well, both of the statements, at least some might argue, are true. It's compatible with how things are now that the pumpkin loaf is not delicious, and it's compatible with how things are that the pumpkin loaf is delicious. That is, the present state of affairs, along with the laws of nature, do not determine one way or the other whether or not this pumpkin loaf is going to be good or bad. In other words, there's nothing about the world that can decide this matter here and now. It will be decided by future events. When I, let's say, pull the pumpkin loaf out of the oven, and those future events are not yet decided. I want to conclude with two quick remarks. The first is that all of the above examples are controversial. There are powerful arguments against metaphysical indeterminacy. As mentioned, some people think that even the idea of metaphysical indeterminacy is incoherent. I'll leave a link in the description to some arguments that cover these types of objections to metaphysical indeterminacy. Second, I haven't actually given you a definition of metaphysical indeterminacy. This is kind of annoying, but there's reason to think that actually giving a clear and precise definition is a pretty difficult and challenging task. Since the examples I've given thus far are pretty heterogeneous in nature. In other words, having fuzzy spatial or temporal boundaries seems a lot different than there being no fact of the matter about the future. So coming up with an idea that links all of those candidates for metaphysical indeterminacy together by pointing out some key properties seems like a challenge given how different those examples are. So thanks for watching. If you have thoughts or comments or concerns, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. And I'm going to end the video with a bunch of glamour shots of this pumpkin loaf.